What if I told you that behind the barbed wire of American prisoner camps, something impossible was happening? Something that would challenge everything you thought you knew about World War II? Picture this. Rows of captured German women, their uniforms torn but their pride intact, throwing back their heads in cruel laughter at their American captors. But by the war's end, that same laughter would tell a completely different story. One of forbidden love that crossed enemy lines and changed lives forever. This is that story. And I guarantee, by the end of this documentary, you'll never think about prisoners of war the same way again. The summer heat of 1944 pressed down on Camp Concordia, Kansas, like a heavy blanket. Dust swirled between the wooden barracks, and the American flag hung limp in the stifling air. But it wasn't the heat that made Sergeant Tom Mitchell's jaw clench as he walked his patrol route. It was the sound that cut through the afternoon silence like broken glass. Laughter. Cold, mocking, deliberate laughter. 37 German women stood in formation behind the chain-link fence, their grey uniforms stained with sweat and travel, their faces hard as granite. They had arrived 3 days ago from the European theatre, nurses, clerks, radio operators and auxiliaries captured during the Wehrmacht's retreat. And every time an American soldier passed their section of the camp, the same ritual played out. They would look him up and down with theatrical disdain, exchange whispered comments in rapid German, and then the laughter would begin. Not the kind born of joy, but something sharper, more cutting, the kind designed to wound. Amerikanische Schwächlinge, one would hiss, American weaklings. Then another would point at a guard's muddy boots and dissolve into theatrical giggles. They laughed at the soldiers' accents when they attempted German phrase. They laughed at their attempts at military bearing. They laughed at everything, as if the very sight of their captors was the most amusing thing in the world. Sergeant Mitchell had seen plenty of German POWs during his 2 years managing the camp. The men usually arrived either broken by defeat or quietly resigned to their fate. But these women? They carried themselves like they were still wearing the uniforms of a victorious army, not prisoners in a foreign land. What the Americans couldn't understand, what they couldn't possibly grasp in those first blazing summer days, was that this laughter wasn't really about them at all. It was armor, carefully crafted and meticulously maintained. Each cruel giggle was another layer of protection against a reality too devastating to acknowledge. They had lost. Their beloved fatherland was crumbling, and now they found themselves at the mercy of the very people they'd been taught to despise. So they laughed. They laughed because the alternative was to break down completely. They laughed because their pride was the only possession the Americans couldn't confiscate. They laughed because somewhere, buried beneath years of propaganda and military conditioning, they suspected that if they stopped laughing, they might start to see their captors as something other than the enemy. And that terrified them more than any prison camp ever could. But as the Kansas sun set each evening, painting the barbed wire gold against the darkening sky, neither the guards nor the prisoners could have imagined where that laughter would eventually lead them. In the months to come, those same voices that rang out with mockery would whisper different words entirely, words that would cross enemy lines and lodge themselves deep in American hearts. The war had brought them together as enemies, but something far more powerful was about to transform them into something else entirely. To understand the defiance that sparked behind that barbed wire, you have to understand who these women really were before the war stripped them of everything they'd once believed about themselves and their world. Greta Hoffmann had been a model Nazi woman. At 24 she'd worn her BDM uniform, the League of German Girls, with the same pride other women wore evening gowns. She'd marched in torchlight parades through the streets of Munich, her blonde hair perfectly braided, her voice raised in songs that promised a 1,000-year Reich. When war came, she'd volunteered as a medical auxiliary, not because she loved healing, but because she loved Germany. Then there was Ingrid Müller, barely 19, who'd grown up in Hitler's shadow. She couldn't remember a time before the swastikas, before the rallies, before the constant drumbeat of propaganda that told her Germans were superior to all other races. Working as a radio operator for the Wehrmacht hadn't been a job for her. It had been a sacred duty, connecting the threads of German military might across a continent they believed was rightfully theirs. Anna Fischer represented something different entirely. At 31, she was older than most, a nurse who'd joined the war effort more from circumstance than conviction. She'd watched her hometown of Dresden transform from a city of art and culture into a military staging ground, and she'd adapted as survival demanded. Her loyalty to the Reich was more pragmatic than passionate, but it was loyalty nonetheless. These women, and the 34 others who'd found themselves behind American barbed wire, had been raised on a very specific vision of America. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as weak, decadent, ruled by Jews, and corrupted by racial mixing. They'd been shown images of breadlines during the Depression, told stories of American soldiers who fled at the FI, first sign of real fighting. America, they'd learned, was a paper tiger, powerful in industry perhaps, but lacking the iron will that made Germans superior. So when they first laid eyes on their American captors in those blazing summer days of 1944, their laughter came from a place of genuine bewilderment. These were the master race's conquerors. These young men with their easy smiles and casual postures. These soldiers who said please and thank you when distributing meals. It seemed impossible, absurd, almost comedic. The women clung to their shared disbelief like a life raft. In the evenings they would gather in their barracks and dissect every interaction with their guards. They mocked the Americans' attempts to speak German, their obvious discomfort with having female prisoners, their apparent ignorance of proper military discipline. Every observation became ammunition for their collective defense against a reality that threatened to shatter everything they'd been taught to believe. But even in those early days, cracks were beginning to show. Greta noticed that the guards' uniforms were better made than she'd expected, their equipment more sophisticated than German propaganda had suggested. Ingrid found herself puzzled by the Americans' obvious education. Many could discuss literature, philosophy, even classical music with surprising depth. Anna, with her medical training, couldn't help but notice the quality of the camp's medical supplies, the obvious care taken to maintain sanitary conditions. These observations were dangerous, so they buried them beneath louder laughter, more theatrical displays of contempt. They called the Americans Befreier, liberators, with dripping sarcasm. They made jokes about American coffee, American movies, American music. They laughed until their sides ached, because stopping meant confronting questions they weren't ready to answer. Questions like, if Americans were so weak, how had they crossed an ocean to defeat the apparently invincible German war machine? If they were so decadent, why were they treating their prisoners with such unexpected humanity? And most dangerous of all, if they were wrong about America, what else might they have been wrong about? The laughter continued through July and into August, but it was beginning to change. The sharp edges were starting to soften, almost imperceptibly, and the American guards, initially bewildered and hurt by the mockery, were beginning to see something else in those women's eyes, something that looked less like hatred and more like fear. What happened next defied everything these German women thought they knew about their enemies, and everything they'd been prepared to endure as prisoners of war. The morning of their 4th day in Camp Concordia, Greta Hoffmann woke to a smell that stopped her cold. Real coffee. Not the bitter ersatz brew they'd choked down for years in Germany, made from roasted acorns and chicory, but actual coffee. Rich, dark, with a warmth that seemed to fill the entire barracks. She sat up on her narrow cot, certain she was dreaming. But it wasn't a dream. Outside, American soldiers were setting up tables laden with food that looked like it belonged in a peacetime restaurant, not a prison camp. Fresh bread, not the sawdust-heavy loaves they'd known in wartime Germany, but soft, white bread that gave way under gentle pressure. There were eggs, actual eggs, scrambled and fluffy, strips of bacon that sizzled and popped, filling the air with a scent that made her stomach clench with forgotten hunger. Ingrid Muller stood frozen at the barracks doorway, watching her fellow prisoners emerge into what felt like an alternate reality. The guards weren't herding them with rifle butts or shouting orders. Instead, they stood back, almost politely, gesturing toward the food with something that looked disturbingly like hospitality. "Was ist das?" Anna Fisher whispered, her medical training making her instinctively suspicious. What is this? Was it some kind of trick? Were they being fattened up for interrogation? Or worse? But their bodies betrayed their caution. These women hadn't eaten a truly full meal in months, perhaps years. The British naval blockade had strangled German food supplies long before their capture, and military rations had been meagre even for auxiliary personnel. Now, faced with more food than they'd seen in one place since before the war, their careful resistance began to crumble. The first bite of real bread brought tears to more than one set of eyes. The coffee, sweet with actual sugar, lightened with fresh cream, tasted like a luxury they'd forgotten existed. And as they ate, something unexpected happened. The American guards began to talk to them. Not interrogate, not command, but actually converse. Sergeant Mitchell approached their table with halting but earnest German. "Wie geht es Ihnen? Ist das Essen gut?" "How are you? Is the food good?" His pronunciation was terrible, his grammar worse, but the effort was genuine. And despite themselves, several of the women found themselves correcting him, offering the proper phrases, even, almost unconsciously, beginning to smile. The days that followed brought revelation after revelation. The barracks were clean, with real mattresses and blankets that smelled of soap instead of mildew. There was a library, an actual library, stocked with German books, classics that had been banned or burned in the Reich's later years. Goethe, Heine, Mann, authors whose works they hadn't seen in years were suddenly available again, as if their captors understood something about German culture that the Nazi regime had forgotten. Medical care was prompt and thorough. Anna Fisher, examining the camp's infirmary with professional interest, found supplies that surpassed what she'd had available in German military hospitals. Sulfur drugs, morphine, real antibiotics, medications that had become precious rarities in wartime Germany were used here routinely, even for prisoners. But perhaps most unsettling of all was the music. Every evening, as the sun set over the Kansas plains, American popular music would drift across the camp from the guards' quarters. Jazz, swing, big band numbers that the Nazi regime had banned as degenerate American music. But listening now, the women found themselves tapping their feet to rhythms that spoke of joy, of celebration, of a culture that seemed vibrantly alive rather than morally corrupt. The laughter that had once rung out with such sharp mockery began to change. It came less frequently now, and when it did emerge, it carried different notes. Sometimes, when a guard stumbled over a German phrase, the women would laugh. But now it was the laughter of teachers amused by an eager student's mistakes, not conquerors mocking their defeated enemies. Greta found herself looking forward to meal times, not just for the food, but for the conversations. The Americans were curious about Germany, about German culture and history, in ways that seemed genuine rather than strategic. They asked about her hometown, about German holidays, about what life had been like before the war. And slowly, almost without realizing it, she began to answer. Not with propaganda slogans, but with real memories of a world that suddenly seemed very far away. The gentle gauntlet of American hospitality was accomplishing what years of Nazi indoctrination had said was impossible. It was making enemies seem human. And as summer turned toward autumn in the Kansas heartland, the women of Camp Concordia found themselves facing a question that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. What if everything they'd been taught about their captors was wrong? By September, the character of Camp Concordia had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The barbed wire still gleamed in the prairie sunlight. The guard towers still cast their long shadows across the compound. but something intangible had shifted in the spaces between captors and captives. It began with language lessons that nobody had officially authorized. Sergeant Mitchell had started it almost by accident, pointing to objects around the mess hall and asking for the German words. "Brot?" he'd ask, holding up a piece of bread. "Kaffee?" pointing to his cup. The women would correct his pronunciation, and slowly, inevitably, they began asking for the English equivalents in return. "Bread?" Greta would repeat carefully, her tongue wrapping around the unfamiliar sounds. "Coffee, morning, thank you." Within weeks, these informal exchanges had evolved into something that looked suspiciously like friendship. Guards would linger at the women's tables during meals, not to monitor conversations, but to participate in them. American soldiers shared photographs from home, girlfriends with victory roll hairstyles, families gathered around Christmas trees, letters from brothers serving in the Pacific. In return, the German women spoke of their own homes, their own families, their own losses in a war that had consumed everything they'd once known. The camp's bulletin board became an unofficial message center. Guards would post newspaper clippings about developments in Europe, not as propaganda but as information these women had a right to know. When news came of the liberation of Paris, or later of German cities falling to Allied forces, the Americans presented it factually, without gloating or celebration. They seemed to understand that each victory for the Allies meant another piece of the world these women had known was crumbling away. But it was the letters that jed everything. Anna Fischer had been the first to ask, could she write to her sister in Munich? Was there any way to know if her family had survived the bombing? The request should have been impossible, prisoners of war writing to family in enemy territory. But Sergeant Mitchell had taken the letter to his commanding officer, who'd taken it to his superior, and somehow, through Red Cross channels and prisoner exchange protocols, it had found its way to Munich. The reply came 6 weeks later, a thin piece of paper that Anna held with trembling hands. Her sister was alive. Their parents had died in an Allied bombing raid, but her sister and her children had survived. They were hungry, cold, living in a basement, but alive. Anna wept that night, the first tears she'd shed since her capture. But they weren't tears of grief alone. Mixed with the sorrow was something else, something that confused and frightened her. Gratitude. Gratitude to her American captors for allowing her this connection to home, for treating her request with respect rather than contempt. Word of Anna's letter spread through the women's barracks like wildfire. Soon, half the prisoners were requesting permission to write home, and incredibly, the Americans agreed. A system developed. Letters would be censored, of course, but carefully, respectfully. Personal news was allowed, expressions of love and concern were permitted. Only military information was removed, and even then the censors would explain what they'd had to redact and why. Ingrid Muller's letter to her mother in Berlin brought news that shattered her world. Her father had been killed not in combat with the Americans, but by Soviet forces advancing from the east. Her mother and younger brother were trapped in Berlin as the Soviets closed in, facing horrors that made American captivity look like salvation by comparison. The American guards noticed Ingrid's anguish. Without being asked, they brought her extra coffee, a warm blanket, a book of poetry in German. Small gestures, but they spoke of a recognition of shared humanity that Ingrid had never expected from her enemies. As autumn deepened into winter, the conversations across the fence grew deeper, more personal. The women learned that many of their guards were barely older than themselves, farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit who'd never wanted to be soldiers but had answered their country's call. In return, they shared their own stories, of nursing wounded soldiers who'd cried for their mothers, of operating radios that carried messages of defeat and retreat, of watching their world collapse around them. The laughter that had once been their armor was becoming something else entirely, the sound of genuine amusement at shared jokes, at cultural misunderstandings that brought people together rather than driving them apart. When Private Johnson tried to explain American baseball to a group of mystified German women, their laughter was warm, inclusive, the sound of friends enjoying a moment of absurdity together. But beneath the growing camaraderie, something deeper and more dangerous was beginning to stir. Greta found herself looking forward to her daily conversations with Sergeant Mitchell, not just for the language practice, but for the way his face lit up when he managed a particularly complex German sentence. Anna noticed that Private Thompson always seemed to find reasons to check on the medical supplies when she was working in the infirmary. Ingrid caught herself searching the faces of the guards each morning, looking for one particular face among them all. The walls of Camp Concordia were beginning to speak a language that neither side had expected to hear, the whispered words of hearts that were learning to recognize themselves in their supposed enemies. And as 1944 drew to a close, those whispers were about to become something that would challenge every rule, every regulation, and every assumption about what was possible between captors and captives in the midst of the world's greatest war. By winter, Camp Concordia had become something unprecedented in the annals of prisoner-of-war camps, a place where enemy hearts were learning to beat in rhythm with each other. The first letter passed between the fence wasn't military intelligence or escape plans. It was a poem. Greta Hoffmann had written it in careful English, her handwriting still uncertain, but her meaning clear. She'd folded it small and pressed it into Sergeant Mitchell's palm during what appeared to be a routine interaction about meal schedules. He'd unfolded it that night in his quarters, reading by lamplight words that would change everything between them. In prison walls, we learn to see that enemies can kindred be. Your gentle words, your patient way, make darkness turn to light of day. It was amateur poetry, awkward in places, but it carried something that transcended literary skill. Authentic emotion from one human being to another. Mitchell had stared at those lines for hours, understanding that he was holding something forbidden, dangerous, and absolutely precious. His response came 3 days later, a piece of paper tucked beneath Greta's meal tray. Wars make enemies of strangers, but kindness makes strangers friends. Behind these walls I've found something I pray this madness never ends. What had begun as language lessons and cultural exchange was transforming into something far more complex and infinitely more risky. Love, as it always does, was finding a way to bloom in the most impossible circumstances. Anna Fisher and Private Thompson's connection had developed differently but with equal intensity. It started with medical discussions. Thompson had some training as a medic and would seek Anna's professional opinion on treating minor injuries among the guards. These consultations, conducted through the fence with careful propriety, gradually became the foundation for deeper conversation. Thompson would bring Anna medical journals from the base library, and she would read them eagerly, hungry for knowledge after years of wartime scarcity. But the journals began arriving with notes tucked between the pages. First professional observations, then personal thoughts, and finally declarations that neither of them had intended to make. "I dream about a world where we could meet as friends instead of enemies," Thompson had written in careful script. "You have healing hands and a healing heart. This war will end someday. What happens to us then?" Anna's response had been equally revealing. "I think of my hands not as German hands or enemy hands, but simply as hands that want to help, to comfort, to touch yours without barbed wire between us." But it was Ingrid Müller whose romance bloomed most dramatically and dangerously. At 19, she was young enough to fall completely, recklessly in love, despite every rational argument against it. The object of her affection was Corporal David Martinez, a 22-year-old from New Mexico whose easy smile and patient kindness had gradually worn down every defense she'd tried to maintain. Their courtship, if it could be called that, took place in stolen moments and careful glances. Martinez had begun teaching Ingrid to play chess, claiming it was for her intellectual stimulation as a prisoner. They would set up the board on opposite sides of the fence, calling out moves, but their real communication happened in the spaces between the game. "Your move, Ingrid," Martinez would say, and she would hear in his voice an affection that went far beyond strategic gameplay. "I am thinking," she would reply, but they both knew she was thinking less about chess pieces and more about the impossibility of their situation. The other prisoners and guards couldn't help but notice the connections forming around them. Some were scandalized. How could German women, trained in loyalty to the fatherland, allow themselves to care for American soldiers? How could American soldiers, sworn to defend their country against German aggression, find themselves falling for their prisoners? But others understood that something larger than politics or nationality was at work. Love, they were discovering, recognized no flags, acknowledged no borders, respected no military regulations. It simply existed, stubborn and undeniable, transforming enemies into beloved strangers and making the impossible feel inevitable. The risks were enormous for everyone involved. Military regulations strictly forbade fraternization between guards and prisoners. For the Americans, a court-martial could mean years in military prison, the end of their military careers, and disgrace that would follow them home. For the German women, these relationships could be seen as collaboration with the enemy, betrayals of their homeland that might mark them as traitors if they ever returned to Germany. But as winter snow began to fall across the Kansas plains, covering the barbed wire in white that made the camp look almost peaceful, love was proving stronger than fear. Notes continued to pass through the fence. Conversations grew more intimate and more dangerous. And in quiet moments, when the guards weren't watching closely enough, hands would reach through the wire to touch, briefly and carefully, confirming that the connection between them was real. Neither side could have imagined, during those first bitter days of laughter and mockery, that they would find themselves here, enemies in uniform discovering that the human heart recognized no distinction between American and German, conqueror and conquered, guard and prisoner. But here they were, and as 1945 approached, they would have to face an impossible question. When the war ended and the camps closed, what would become of love that had bloomed behind barbed wire? As spring arrived in 1945, the weight of their uniforms had become almost unbearable for everyone at Camp Concordia. Those pieces of cloth that had once defined identity, loyalty, and purpose now felt like chains binding them to a world that was rapidly ceasing to exist. The German women could hear the war ending in the silence of their own conversations. Letters from home, when they came at all, spoke of cities in ruins, of governments collapsing, of a Reich that had promised to last 1,000 years crumbling after barely 12. The laughter that had once served as their armor was now replaced by a different sound entirely, the quiet weeping of women mourning a homeland that was disappearing even as they lived and breathed thousands of miles away. But the most painful tears weren't for Germany itself. They were for the impossible choices that victory and defeat would force upon hearts that had learned to love across enemy lines. Greta Hoffmann lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her barracks, wrestling with questions that felt like physical weight on her chest. Was she betraying her country by caring for Tom Mitchell? Or had her country betrayed her first, by filling her head with lies about American weakness and cruelty? When she looked at Tom now, she didn't see an enemy soldier. She saw a man who brought her books, who struggled to pronounce German poetry just to make her smile, who had shared photographs of his sister's wedding and wept when she told him about friends who had died in Berlin. "Ich bin eine Verräterin," she whispered to herself in the darkness. "I am a traitor." But traitor to what? To a regime that had led her country to ruin? To a cause that had brought nothing but death and destruction? Or was she betraying herself by denying what her heart had discovered about the humanity of the man she was learning to love? Anna Fischer faced her own agonizing internal war. At 31, she was old enough to understand the complexity of what was happening to her, wise enough to see the broader implications of her feelings for Private Thompson. She had watched him treat wounded German prisoners with the same care he would give to American soldiers. She had seen him work extra shifts to ensure that medical supplies reached the camp's infirmary. She had observed his quiet kindness to elderly German POWs who reminded him of his grandfather. How could such a man be her enemy? How could his country, which had produced such men, be the evil empire she'd been taught to hate? But the questions tormented her precisely because she knew there were no easy answers. Americans had bombed German cities, killing civilians. American soldiers had fought and killed German boys who were somebody's sons, brothers, lovers. The war was real, the destruction was real, the grief on both sides was absolutely real. Yet here she was, caring deeply for one of those American soldiers, finding in him a gentleness and integrity that challenged everything she'd believed about this conflict. For Ingrid Müller, the youngest and perhaps the most deeply in love, the weight of choosing between heart and homeland was almost crushing. At 19, she had lived her entire conscious life under Nazi rule, had known no other reality than the one that had taught her to hate Americans. Everything she had believed about herself, about her world, about right and wrong, was bound up in her identity as a German woman loyal to the fatherland. But David Martinez had shown her a different way of being human. Through their chess games and stolen conversations, she had glimpsed a world where people could disagree without hating, where nations could conflict without their citizens becoming mortal enemies, where love could exist even in the midst of war. "What will happen to us when this ends?" she had asked him one evening, the question escaping before she could stop it. David had stared at her through the chain-link fence, his dark eyes full of the same pain she felt. "I don't know," he'd answered honestly. "I don't know if they'll let us stay in touch. I don't know if you'll want to once you're home. I don't know if what we feel here is real enough to survive out there." But then he'd reached through the fence to touch her fingers, just for a moment, and added, "I know I want to find out." The American soldiers were facing their own moral complexities. They had enlisted to fight fascism, to defeat an ideology that threatened the world's freedom. They had seen the evidence of Nazi atrocities, had liberated concentration camps, had witnessed the systematic brutality of the regime they were fighting. They knew that the war they were fighting was just, necessary, vital. Yet here were German women who challenged every assumption about the enemy they'd been trained to hate. These weren't the cold, fanatical devotees of Nazi ideology they'd expected to encounter. They were young women who missed their families, who cried when they received news of loved ones killed in bombing raids, who laughed at simple jokes and wrote poetry, and worried about their future with the same anxieties that kept American soldiers awake at night. Sergeant Mitchell found himself questioning not the righteousness of the war, but the completeness of the hatred he'd been encouraged to feel. Could you fight a regime while loving its people? Could you work to defeat a nation while caring deeply for its citizens? Could you be loyal to your own country while recognizing the humanity of its enemies? These questions followed him through his daily routines, shadowed his conversations with fellow soldiers, and haunted his dreams. He was still proud to wear his American uniform, still believed in the cause he was fighting for. But he was no longer certain that uniform required him to hate everyone on the other side. As news of Germany's surrender began to filter through official channels in late April 1945, everyone at Camp Concordia understood that their strange, suspended world was about to end. The women would be repatriated to whatever remained of Germany. The soldiers would be reassigned or discharged to return to their own lives. The connections they had forged, the love they had discovered, the friendships they had built, all of it would be tested by an ocean's distance and a world that might not understand what had happened between enemies who had learned to see each other as human beings. The weight of their uniforms was about to be replaced by an even heavier burden. The choice between the safety of forgetting and the courage of remembering what their hearts had discovered behind the barbed wire of Camp Concordia, May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day arrived at Camp Concordia not with celebration, but with the heavy silence of impending goodbye. The official announcement came over the camp's loudspeaker system at 1400 hours. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Within 6 weeks, all German prisoners would be processed for repatriation to their homeland, or what remained of it. In the women's barracks, 37 German prisoners received this news with emotions too complex for easy categorization. Relief that the killing had finally stopped mixed with terror about what they would find when they returned home. Joy that they might see surviving family members again, battled with despair at leaving the men they had learned to love. Greta Hoffmann sat on her narrow cot, holding the last letter she had received from her sister in Munich. The city was in ruins, her sister wrote. Food was scarce, medicine almost non-existent. Soviet and American occupation forces were struggling to maintain order among millions of displaced persons, refugees, and survivors of the Nazi regime's collapse. It would be a hard homecoming, a return to a country that no longer existed in any recognizable form. But the hardest part wasn't imagining the physical destruction waiting for her in Germany. The hardest part was imagining life without Tom Mitchell's daily presence, without their evening conversations about literature and philosophy, without the quiet moments when their fingers would touch through the fence and she would feel, for just an instant, that the war had never happened at all. "How do you say goodbye to someone who saved your soul?" she asked Anna Fisher that evening, as the two women sat together watching the sunset paint the Kansas sky in shades of gold and red. Anna had no answer. She was facing her own impossible farewell. Private Thompson had permission to write to her once she returned to Germany, to help her obtain medical supplies for whatever hospital or clinic might need her services. It was a practical arrangement, he'd explained to his commanding officer, a way for American medical relief efforts to connect with qualified German medical personnel in the aftermath of war. But both Anna and Thompson knew it was much more than that. It was a lifeline thrown across an ocean, a fragile connection that might allow their love to survive separation and time. Whether that lifeline would hold, whether either of them would be strong enough to grasp it when they were back in their separate worlds, remained to be seen. Ingrid Müller and David Martinez faced perhaps the most impossible situation of all. At 19 and 22, they were young enough to believe in forever and old enough to understand how rarely forever actually lasted. They had spent their final weeks together making promises that felt both absolutely true and utterly fantastical. "I'll find you," David had whispered to her during their last chess game, the board forgotten between them as they pressed their faces close to the chain-link fence. "I don't care how long it takes or what I have to do. When things settle down over there, when the world makes sense again, I'll find you." "And I'll wait," Ingrid had whispered back, tears streaming down her face. "I'll wait because what we have is worth waiting for. Because you showed me that love is stronger than war, than nations, than everything they told us to hate about each other." But even as they made these promises, both understood the obstacles they faced. International communication was chaotic in the aftermath of war. Germany was divided into occupation zones controlled by different Allied powers. Millions of people were displaced, missing, struggling simply to survive. The chances of maintaining contact across such distance and devastation seemed impossibly small. The American soldiers were struggling with their own conflicted emotions. They had won the war they'd been sent to fight, had defeated fascism and liberated Europe from Nazi oppression. They should have been celebrating, should have been proud and satisfied with their victory. Instead, many found themselves mourning the end of relationships that had taught them more about humanity than all their military training combined. Sergeant Mitchell requested a transfer to post-war occupation duty in Germany. His official reason was professional development, a desire to contribute to reconstruction efforts. His real reason was the hope that he might find Greta again, might help her navigate the chaos of a defeated nation, might discover whether love could survive in a world no longer divided by barbed wire. Private Thompson began studying German with an intensity that surprised his fellow soldiers. He told them he wanted to be prepared, Die for reconstruction duties, wanted to be able to communicate effectively with German civilians. In reality, he was preparing for the letters he hoped to write to Anna, the conversations he dreamed of having when they could finally speak as free people rather than guard and prisoner. The final day came with shocking suddenness. On June 15th, 1945, the women of Camp Concordia were loaded onto trains bound for New York, where they would board ships for the journey back to Europe. The goodbyes were hurried, awkward, conducted under the watchful eyes of superior officers who had noticed the connections between their soldiers and the prisoners, but had chosen, perhaps wisely, to look the other way during the war's final months. As the train pulled away from the platform, 37 German women pressed their faces to the windows, watching American soldiers grow smaller and smaller in the distance. Many were crying, not just for the men they were leaving behind, but for the version of themselves they had discovered in this unlikely place. They had come to Camp Concordia as proud servants of the Third Reich, armored in arrogance and sustained by hatred. They were leaving as women who had learned to love their enemies, who had discovered humanity in the most unexpected places, who carried in their hearts proof that the world was more complex and more hopeful than any ideology had taught them to believe. The American soldiers stood on that platform long after the train had disappeared into the distance, each lost in his own thoughts about what they had experienced and what they had lost. They had entered this war as young men certain of who was good and who was evil, who deserved their loyalty and who merited their hatred. They were ending it as more complex human beings, carrying with them the knowledge that love could bloom anywhere, that enemies could become beloved, that the human heart recognized no national boundaries. As the summer of 1945 stretched ahead of them, all they could do was hope that the promises whispered through barbed wire would prove stronger than the ocean that now separated them from the women who had changed their understanding of what it meant to be human in a world at war. 78 years have passed since that train pulled away from Camp Concordia, carrying 37 German women back to a homeland that existed only in memory. 78 years since American soldiers stood on a Kansas platform, watching the horizon swallow the most meaningful relationships of their young lives. What happened next defied every prediction, exceeded every hope, and proved that love, real love, recognizes no statute of limitations. Of the 37 women who returned to Germany in the summer of 1945, 23 maintained contact with the American soldiers they had met behind barbed wire. Letters crossed the Atlantic despite chaotic postal systems and military censorship. Care packages filled with medical supplies and food made their way from American hometowns to bomb-damaged German cities. And slowly, impossibly, love letters began to follow. Greta Hoffmann and Tom Mitchell were married in Munich in 1947, with Anna Fischer serving as maid of honor and Private Thompson, now Corporal Thompson, serving as best man at a ceremony that would have been unthinkable just 3 years earlier. Greta immigrated to Mitchell's hometown in Iowa, where she became a beloved high school German teacher and raised 3 children who grew up hearing bedtime stories about how their parents had met during the greatest war in human history. Anna Fischer never remarried. She and Thompson maintained a correspondence that lasted 47 years until his death in 1992. Their letters, discovered by Thompson's children among his personal effects, revealed a love affair conducted entirely on paper, deep, sustained, intellectually rich, and emotionally satisfying in ways that defied conventional understanding. Anna used Thompson's connections to obtain medical supplies for her work in post-war German hospitals, and he used her insights to help American relief organizations better understand the needs of German civilians. Their love became a bridge between former enemies, facilitating healing on both sides of the Atlantic. But it was Ingrid Müller and David Martinez whose story became the most dramatic testament to the power of love over geography, politics, and time. David kept his promise. In 1948, he managed to track Ingrid to a displaced persons camp outside Hamburg, where she was working as a translator for American occupation forces. Their reunion, witnessed by camp personnel who later described it as something out of a Hollywood movie, led to a marriage that lasted 62 years and produced 5 children, 14 grandchildren, and 23 great-grandchildren, who carry in their veins the living proof that enemies can become family. The laughter that had once served as armor for 37 frightened German women became, in time, the soundtrack of family gatherings in Iowa farmhouses and New Mexico ranches, German-American Christmases where traditional stollen was served alongside American apple pie, and wedding celebrations where grandchildren danced to music that blended German folk songs with American jazz. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these stories isn't the individual happy endings. It's what they represented for a world struggling to understand how peace could emerge from the ashes of the most destructive war in human history. The children and grandchildren of these unions grew up hearing a different version of World War II than what appeared in most history books. They learned that wars were fought between governments and ideologies, not between peoples. They understood that propaganda could make neighbors seem like monsters, but that proximity and patience could reveal the humanity in anyone. They discovered that love, whether romantic, platonic, or familial, was the most powerful force for breaking down the barriers that politicians and generals worked so hard to construct. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of VE Day, the surviving couples and families gathered for a reunion in Kansas, not far from the site of the old Camp Concordia. The barbed wire was long gone, the barracks demolished, the guard towers nothing but memories. But the laughter that filled that gathering was unmistakably the same sound that had once echoed across a prisoner of war camp, transformed from an instrument of defiance into an expression of joy, from armor against enemies into a bridge between friends. Greta Mitchell, then 75 years old, stood at the podium during that reunion dinner and delivered words that captured something essential about what they had all experienced. "We came together as enemies," she said, her voice still carrying traces of the German accent she had never completely lost. "We were taught to hate each other, to see each other as less than human. But somehow, in that place of wire and walls, we discovered something that no war could destroy and no government could regulate, the simple truth that the human heart knows no nationality." She paused, looking out at the faces gathered before her. American veterans now in their 70s, German women who had become American wives and mothers, children and grandchildren who existed because love had proved stronger than hatred, the Löcher. "What are you here tonight," she continued, "is the same laughter that once tried to protect us from seeing the humanity in our enemies. But love taught us that we didn't need protection from that humanity. We needed to embrace it. And in embracing it, we found not just romantic love, but a deeper understanding of what it means to be human in a world that often seems determined to divide us." As the evening wound down and families prepared to return to their homes scattered across America, the last sound to fade from the gathering was laughter. Genuine, warm, inclusive laughter that carried within it the echo of voices that had once tried to armor themselves against the very connections that had ultimately transformed their lives. Today, in a world that often seems as divided as it was in 1945, the story of Camp Concordia serves as a powerful reminder that the barriers between us and them are never as solid as they appear, that enemies can become beloved, that laughter can be transformed from a weapon into a bridge, and that love, stubborn, persistent, inexplicable love, remains humanity's best hope for finding peace in the midst of conflict. The barbed wire has long since rusted away, but the connections forged behind it continue to ripple through generations, proving that some bonds are strong enough to outlast the wars that create them, and wise enough to teach the world that even in humanity's darkest hours, light can find a way to shine through. In the end, the laughter had the last word, not the bitter laughter of enemies mocking their captors, but the joyful laughter of people who had discovered that love, against all odds and despite all obstacles, really can conquer hate.